Welcome to day 2 of Parapsychology Foundation International Affiliates Conference. And this time we have with us Dr. Chris Rowe from the University of Northampton, whose title is Parapsychology Research and Education in the UK. Chris Rowe is Professor of Psychology at the University of Northampton. He is research leader for the Psychology Division and director of the Center for the Study of Anomalous Psychological Processes. He is president of the Parapsychological Association, woohoo, again, right? Chairman of the British Psychological Society, the Transpersonal Psychology Section, a council member for the Society for Psychical Research, and the international affiliate for England of the Parapsychology Foundation. He edits the Journal of the Society for Psychical Research as well. His research interests are around understanding the nature of anomalous experiences and includes research on the phenomenology of paranormal experience, particularly as it affects well-being, the psychology of paranormal belief and of deception, as well as experimental approaches to test claims for extrasensory perception and psychokinesis, particularly where they involve psychological factors. Recent research has been concerned with unconscious measures of psi and predicting performance using a composite personality measure called lability. He has published over 80 journal articles and book chapters and given over 100 invited and conference presentations, as well as several for us in the various activities of the Azire and the Parapsychology Foundation. So here's your slide, and you remember how to pick up your pointer and all that good stuff?
I shall try.
Okay, off to the left, and I'm getting out of your way.
Okay, there we are. So that's the pointer moving around. Hooray. And I switch up here, don't I? Fantastic. Okay, so hello everybody. I hope you can hear me. Please do let me know in the side panel if I'm speaking too quickly or otherwise there's a problem. I'll try not to be distracted by the side panel though. Welcome to lovely UK, where the temperature currently is 14 degrees. We had about half an inch of snow and that quickly went away over the last few weeks. So perfectly pleasant. So hopefully there shouldn't be any meteorological interference with us today. I want to thank Nancy and Carlos and Lisette for kindly inviting me to speak to you today about parapsychology research and education in the UK. My biggest problem, of course, is that it's quite a vast subject. People, academics in particular in the UK, have been interested in psychical research since well before the establishment of the Society for Psychical Research back in 1882. So that's a vast amount of material to try and cover in any way that would do it justice in such a short talk. So I'm not going to be talking about research before about 1985, when I'll argue there's a pivotal moment with the foundation of the Koestler Parapsychology Unit and the ripple effect that that has had on research in the UK. So I'm going to focus on that. And also I'm going to restrict my talk really to research that's taken place within university settings. So academics who have tenure within university departments, most typically within psychology departments. And again, that's really just to make the presentation manageable rather than for any other reason. There's a proliferation of interest at the moment among amateur groups in conducting research into hauntings, apparitions, other poltergeist cases, mediumship and so on. And that work is amateur in the true sense of the word. It's primarily conducted by people who are very enthusiastic about the subject and they conduct the research in their own time. Again, it's very laudable, and indeed a fair amount of the research that we publish in the SPR journal would be of those types: case collections, field investigations, interviews and so on. Very legitimate, but I don't really have time to cover that material either. So I'm fairly narrowly focusing on research within university departments in the UK. Nevertheless, there's still quite a lot of such research, and so this is going to be a very broad brush kind of treatment. My main aim really is just to give you a flavour of the various approaches and methods that have been used over the last 10 or 15 years in particular, and the kinds of topics that people have been interested in, that they've conducted research on, and that they've gone to publish about. I've placed this back at 1985 as my starting point because just prior to 1985, with the joint death of Arthur and Cynthia Koestler, in their will they bequeathed their estate for the establishment of a chair devoted to the investigation of parapsychological phenomena. In fact, it was for research into the capacity attributed to some individuals to interact with their environment by means other than the recognised sensory and motor channels, and it reflected Koestler's long-standing interest in various forms of paranormal and psychic phenomena, particularly as they reflect an attribute of human beings as part of the human condition. The University of Edinburgh competed for that bequest and was successful, mainly thanks to the assistance of John Belloff, who was extremely well known as a researcher, philosopher really, but he oversaw and supervised research, empirical research into parapsychology, and so the Koestler Parapsychology chair was established, and Bob Morris was the incumbent, the first and only recipient of that chair. He arrived in November 1985, and before he came over, he had a long chat with a very close friend of his, Jim Carpenter, in which he discussed his plans for the Koestler chair. This was a substantial amount of money, but not world-changing. It wouldn't be enough to do some kind of comprehensive, integrated, worldwide type of research project, but it was enough to maintain a solid foothold that would have longevity, that would be viable for a prolonged period of time, and that might provide some kind of shelter or forum for the education of the next generation. Jim quoted Bob as saying specifically that in his role as Koestler Professor, he intended to take the long view with the post, investing the time and effort to build good relations with other academic disciplines and to develop a quality program that could generate excellent scholars who would then go on to take academic posts at other universities, seeding the intellectual landscape of Britain and Europe with parapsychological experts in a way that had not yet proven possible in the US. Sadly, Bob died prematurely in 2004 at the age of 62, but nevertheless, even in such a short time, in those 19 years, Bernard Carr estimated that he'd been responsible for supervising 25 PhD students to completion, which is a very significant, impressive figure given the ordinary attrition rates that you see with PhD supervisions, and that he estimated that of those 25, 15 had continued to work in parapsychology and had secured academic positions, either at Edinburgh or elsewhere. In fact, his figures were slightly off. I recalculated that myself, and I found, if I click on the next slide, that in fact there are 26 students that Bob supervised successfully to completion, and here they are listed. And hopefully many of these names will seem familiar to you. These are people who have been influential in the field over the last 15-20 years, many of whom are well established as mainstream and now senior figures working in the discipline, who have helped to shape and direct the course of parapsychology in the 21st century. Now, most importantly for now, Bob's idea was that in order to be successful, in order to ensure the long-term viability of parapsychology, these graduates had to be employable. They had to be able to take up academic positions within university departments where they could secure tenure and therefore have the same kind of protection that he'd experienced, be able to plan for the longer term, to be able to supervise their own students in due course, and then for those students to supervise students in turn. This is the way in which we populate the parapsychology of the future, but also the way in which we ensure that we have a community of academics who may not be active researchers in parapsychology, but are well versed in the principles of parapsychology, the sound methods that are used, the dispassionate way in which people come to the subject, in contrast to the way that we tend to be portrayed by skeptics as people who are deeply invested in a non-material worldview and that we're really striving to cultivate evidence in order to persuade people of a more spiritual underlying reality. Bob wanted to get across to people the idea that, in fact, Parapsychologists tend to be researchers doing good, sound research, who are asking questions of nature and are very willing to listen to the answers that nature provides, rather than trying to impose some kind of worldview that maybe is more attractive but isn't justified by the evidence. So we have a bunch of people here that successfully graduated, many of whom are still in academia. I've highlighted some here who have gone on to supervise. So we have a number of people who in turn have supervised their own students, and here they are in a little bit more detail. And we can see that sense of proliferation as we move through the generations. Many people reflected on Bob's influence and his legacy, talk particularly about a family tree. And so Bob would be at the head of that family tree, and he was very productive. He had many, many children. 26 of us are his children. And then the students that we in turn supervise would class themselves as the grandchildren of Bob Morris. And certainly that's something that is very heartwarming for people. I know many of my own students are very proud of that connection to Bob and his legacy. And so this generation here in orange reflects those grandchildren of Bob Morris thus far. The ones who are in normal text are people who have graduated in turn. They have their PhDs and are eligible to be established in university departments. Some of them have gone on to do that again. The ones who are italicized are current PhD students across various universities. And then if we click again, we see another generation. The emboldened people in turn are supervising their own students, and here they are down the bottom. And we see now that we have some great grandchildren, people who can trace their legacy back to Bob. Among these, I think perhaps Ben Roberts might be in a position to supervise now. I'll mention him in a minute when we talk about Derby, but of the others it's maybe a little bit premature to think about great-great-grandchildren. But there seems to be a fairly standard classical model for how interest in the subject area is maintained across generations. It's mediated through effective supervision through into the next generation. And so the question is, that seems on the face of it to be relatively successful, and I guess if I had an underlying motive in this talk, it is to encourage others to think about this kind of a model, this slow burn, that the effort invested in supervising students is never wasted and leads to the long-term security of the discipline and creates people who are your peers and your colleagues very soon. They're students for very little time in actual fact. So obviously there are way too many people here for them all to be employed at the University of Edinburgh and to bolster the Koestler Parapsychology Unit. And so on this next slide, what I've done is I've tried to overview the diaspora, the spreading out of researchers, particularly across the UK. Now some of these people are based further afield, but I don't really have time again to talk about that just now. Happy to pick up that in questions. And you'll notice, for example, that Robin Taylor is also a PF affiliate, I think for the Philippines. I wish we could swap roles perhaps when I look at the weather outside, but I'll stay where I am. And so we're going to concentrate instead on those people who are UK based. So this is a map of the UK. Originally I was going to talk about England, but as I've mentioned before, it doesn't seem very sensible to exclude Scotland, given that many of us owe a debt of gratitude. Our training took place at Edinburgh when we were part of the Koestler Parapsychology Unit. So I've included Scotland as part of this map. And here are various people around the country who have tenure, who are based in university departments, some of whom I'm going to talk about in a little bit more detail, just to give you a flavour of the education and training opportunities that they offer in their departments, and also to give you an idea of the approaches that they use and the topics that they're particularly interested in. Some of these I haven't included on individual slides, and so I'm just going to say a little bit more about one or two folks that I don't have the time to describe further. Many of these people can trace their heritage back to Bob and the Edinburgh unit. Some don't, but of course that quickly becomes intermingled a little bit. So the first person I'm going to speak about is over here, and this is David Wilde. He was actually a student of Craig Murray over here at one time. He's now established at Nottingham-Trent University. He actually is supervising a project with a graduate of ours at Northampton, Andrew Hodrian, and they're working on a research project looking at out-of-body experiences. And David Wilde has had a long-standing interest in near-death experiences and out-of-body experiences, and in the tradition of Craig Murray, tends to adopt a qualitative approach in exploring that, so understanding the experiences from the experience's own perspective, getting their own understanding and their tribute to their experiences. So they're doing some really interesting work. He recently has been a little bit less productive, and this is quite an early stage for his unit. Certainly in my experience, it takes quite a while to build up the kind of motive force, the impetus, the inertia to start to grow and develop, and he's just in the early stages of that, but it's very encouraging. I also don't mention Richard Wiseman very much at the moment, and this of course isn't a slight. Richard's done some really interesting work at the University of Hertfordshire, very much from a sceptical perspective, but he's been extremely important in serving as a supervisor for a number of students who've gone on to remain in the field of parapsychology, and certainly reflects the ethos of Edinburgh, which is that parapsychology is about the psychology of anomalous experience. It includes taking people's claims seriously and subjecting them to empirical tests, so not dismissing claims out of hand, but also becoming well versed in psychological phenomena that might account for some of those experiences. And I think Richard has made an important contribution in that area. I chatted with Richard by email recently to ask about his recent work, and he's not really very active in parapsychology anymore, and it's for that reason that I don't say too much more about him. In some ways, his role is taken up by Chris French, and I'll say a little bit more about the work that Chris is doing in a few moments. Yep, there is a gorilla with Richard, that's right, and I can tell you more about that later. I'll leave that as some kind of cryptic hook, and if you want, we can talk about that during questions. I'll also mention David Luke a little bit later. Here we have Paul Rogers, who's recently moved down to the University of Winchester. He is actually one of these students of Richard Wiseman that I'm talking about. He's still very active in parapsychology, but has recently experienced a switch from one university to another, and is in the process of developing his research unit. His interests are very much around the psychology of paranormal belief and looking at the cognitive psychology of that. And it's extremely interesting, very detailed, deep work that very much deserves people's attention. But again, I don't really, in the short amount of time that we've got today, have the opportunity to talk about his work. I'm going to say a little bit about these two guys who, again, are people who were very influential in the field for some time, drifted away but have come back, and we're going through quite an optimistic phase with them. I'll tell you more about them in a minute. I'll move to these two over here. So we have, in Warwickshire, we have the University of Coventry. One of the first people to seed a university department outside of Edinburgh was Tony Lawrence, and he established a parapsychology program there, and then later on a master's program. And Tony isn't so active in parapsychology anymore as he was. He did some really important work, particularly around things like the sheep-goat effect, again the psychology of paranormal belief, but also was very interested in Ganzfeld research, a technique that I'll talk about in a little while, in case you're unfamiliar with that term, but basically an experimental technique intended to produce conducive conditions for producing extrasensory perception effects. And I mention him because one of his graduate students is here, that's Ian Hume, and he's now, although he was and still is at Coventry, he's attached to Coventry, he's also down here at the University of Cardiff now, and his PhD was also looking at Ganzfeld ESP research, doing a lot of work there. Interestingly, the most active researcher at Coventry now is Simon Sherwood, an ex-colleague of mine. He came to the University of Northampton to take up a lectureship back in about 1997, 98. He warned me, though, that he wasn't somebody who tended to stay in one department for very long, that he tended to get itchy feet and would want to move on. But he stayed with us for about 15 years before he moved on, and is now at the University of Coventry. And is still very interested in particularly field work, so haunting investigations and the psychology of spontaneous experience. Up here in Lancashire, we have two centres which are developing. Craig Murray, that I mentioned before, he spent time at the University of Manchester and is now at the University of Lancaster. And his research is particularly focused on the phenomenology, the qualitative psychology of anomalous experience and understanding it. And as I said, among his students was David Wilde. His collaborators at one time were people like Ken Drinkwater here, who's based at Manchester Metropolitan. He's just finishing up his PhD, which is focused on developing a new measure of paranormal belief, one which is a little bit more psychometrically robust than the ones that we're used to doing, and hopefully is a little less unfair when it comes to how one generalizes from belief in the supernatural and belief in parapsychological phenomena that maybe more effectively differentiates between those. So Ken's very active working away. Craig is less active these days, he's moved on to other things, but his is a name that you might have heard if you've been looking at research in parapsychology over the last 15 years or so. He's been very active. So the people I've not mentioned are the ones I'm going to focus on in a little bit more depth. And as I say, the intention really is to tell you a little bit more about the setup that they have in their various departments, the opportunities for education and training with them, and also to give you a flavour of the kinds of research projects that they've been involved with recently. And it hopefully illustrates the diversity that exists currently in the United Kingdom. So it makes sense to begin then with Edinburgh. So the research centre at Edinburgh is the Koestler Parapsychology Unit. They have a very good, very detailed website that's well worth checking out. It's got some important core information there, FAQ and so on. That tells you a little bit more about the people and the projects that are going on there. The main faculty at Edinburgh are Caroline Watt and Pete Lamont, and they are people who were there when Bob was chair of the unit and have remained there and continue that unit. Caroline is the nominal lead with that group, and through the KPU it is possible to take an undergraduate option in parapsychology, so that's more the experimental approaches to parapsychology, but also Pete offers a history of unorthodox psychology module as well up there. So Pete is primarily, his background is as a historian, and his approach is more like more concerned with what history can teach us about accounts of particularly Victorian phenomena and understanding Victorian investigations within their proper context, their social and political contexts. So there are opportunities there still to register to conduct PhDs. If you're starting out in parapsychology, it's possible to take an online program with them, which if you follow this kind of thing down here, this isn't a live link, that's why I hesitated. I could turn it into a live link or provide that for you. You can find out more about the online program, which is a program a little bit like MOOCs such as this. It's online and it's provided by a variety of experts who speak to various topics and give you a solid grounding in the subject, hopefully. In recent times, Caroline's research has been focused around her tenure as the Parrots Warwick Senior Researcher, a position she held from 2010 to 2015. This is a very prestigious position. Other holders in the past have been people like Rupert Sheldrake, Richard Wiseman as examples, and this provides an opportunity to devote your time, pretty much full time, to working on parapsychological projects. And during this time, Caroline has been particularly interested in understanding the nature of precognition, and she's taken a multi-faceted approach to understanding people's experiences of precognition and scrutinizing the explanations that have been offered for those experiences. And this really is very much in the tradition of the KPU and their original understanding of what parapsychology's subject matter is. So it reflects both taking the claims seriously and subjecting them to test under controlled conditions that would rule out normal explanations, but also testing those normal explanations as well and seeing how far they can go to account for the phenomena themselves. And so Caroline has done that in a variety of ways. So she's been conducting some controlled experiments looking at precognitive dreaming. The first one of those involved people who would volunteer to participate, people who had good dream recall, were open to the idea that precognition might occur. I've just realized, of course, that you may not know what I mean by precognition. So precognition is a form of extrasensory perception, ESP, and extrasensory perception refers to those phenomena in which it seems as if people are able to acquire information from their environment that goes beyond what's available through the normal sensory channels or through rational inference. And so within ESP we would have things like telepathy and clairvoyance, So telepathy is where we think we know something that somebody else is thinking of, or we're able to share somebody else's experience. Clairvoyance would be situations in which we acquire information from our environment. So we know something, for example, such as the location of a lost object that other people, nobody knows where that is, and we seem to acquire that information in some kind of non-local way. And precognition refers to situations in which the information that we acquire doesn't actually exist at the time we have our experience, and that we seem to be able to acquire it from our own or other people's futures. So the classic example of that in spontaneous cases is that people would report that they'd had a disturbing dream, one that they might have felt compelled to act on or that felt different from their normal dreams, and then later on some event occurs that they feel is a confirmation of that dream. Perhaps they had a dream about a relative of theirs being involved in a hunting accident. Later on, that relative of theirs truly was involved in a hunting accident, even though that was out of character. They don't normally go hunting, or they're normally very safe in the way that they behave or practice when they go hunting, and nevertheless that seemed to transpire. So that would be ostensibly, on the face of it, a case of precognition that we might be interested in. So Caroline was interested to explore that experimentally by having people sleep at home as normal in their homes, but to keep a diary, to keep an account of their dreams, and to then submit those accounts before they were presented with what was intended to be their confirming event. And in this case, that would be a video clip that was randomly chosen for them to be their target. Now, because they didn't have any idea what that target might be, the clip was randomly chosen, they couldn't infer what it was, there'd be no normal way for them to be able to make some kind of perhaps unconscious calculation to dream about certain things and not other things. In providing the account, they then were provided feedback, so they got to see what the actual target was for them, and so they had reinforcement. There was a sense of closure, but their accounts were then given to an independent judge, and the independent judge would rate those descriptions for similarity with not only the target video clip, but also some alternatives, some decoys. And at the time when the judge is making the judgments, they wouldn't know which was which. They wouldn't know which was the actual target for this person and which were the decoys. And in that way, that allows us to see whether the dreams actually do relate more to the actual event than we might expect just by chance. For example, if we have 4 alternatives, as Caroline had, then the independent judge might pick the actual target one time in 4, or 25% of the time, in any particular set of trials. And if we see that the judge is actually picking the target much more than 25% of the time, well, that seems like it might be interesting. Maybe there's some other cause, some other factor at work. And interestingly, in the first study that Caroline ran, the hit rate was actually 32%. So it was significantly above chance expectation, under conditions where it's very easy to rule out most of the normal explanations. She was also interested to look at internal effects there, so she was interested to see whether it was related to people's confidence or to their correspondence ratings, and there were no other internal effects that she could find. She also explored whether studies that were conducted in dream laboratories might actually give stronger effects than those where people just sleep at home. And in fact, that second study was non-significant. People didn't do at all well in that study. They were performing at chance. So when you bring people into a sleep laboratory where you can monitor their brainwave activity, their EEG, overnight, you can identify the characteristic signs that they're in a REM period, so they're actively dreaming typically, and you can wake them up towards the end of those REM periods, and you can solicit their dreams from them when they're fresh. Even under those circumstances, that didn't seem to help them to capture an ESP effect. And that gives you a flavour of that kind of approach that Caroline's taken, the experimental approach. She was also very interested in psychological factors. Some of the standard explanations for spontaneous experiences are, for example, that there is an antecedent, there's a causal factor that's responsible both for the real life effect, the real world effect, and also that might be seeded in your dream. Rather frivolously, an example I give is if a girl dreams about a warehouse setting on fire, and then the next day she discovers that that warehouse has indeed set on fire, and the fire brigades have come out and put the fire out. We'd be less impressed by that correspondence if we later discover that she's the health and safety officer for that warehouse, and that perhaps maybe we might suspect at some level that as she's doing her tours around the building and checking the safety aspects, maybe not even at a conscious level, perhaps subconsciously, she has become aware that there may be some non-optimal practices, that there may be some susceptibility to outbreaks of fire. Putting all those old newspapers right next to that roaring furnace probably wasn't the best of ideas, and perhaps that's been bubbling under unconsciously, and it's been given a voice through a dream. Dreams are very commonly a forum in which unconscious concerns or desires might be played out, perhaps dramatized in some way, and allows us to work with and confront issues that we find difficult to deal with in a normal conscious way, and that could very much be what's going on in her case. So Caroline was interested to see whether perhaps some people who have are more sensitive to environmental cues, maybe not at a conscious level but at a very subtle level, are they the ones that tend to believe in precognition and tend to report more precognitive effects? And she didn't find any evidence for that in her questionnaire-based studies. She was also interested to see whether there might be motivational differences. Maybe some people, because of their prior beliefs, are more likely to see correspondences where other people wouldn't see any linkage at all. So for example, maybe we have a dream and then what we think is a confirming event, but we actually have to work quite hard creatively to join the two together to see linkages, and that for another person those linkages would look very tenuous indeed. And certainly Caroline found in one of her studies that when people were asked to make a judgment about the correspondence between somebody's dream diary and the event that it was supposed to be related to, paranormal believers tended to rate those similarities more highly and see more correspondences than did disbelievers. And that difference seemed to be not a cognitive difference but a motivational difference, because it didn't extend to other situations where the material wasn't about psychic experiences or psychic phenomena. So I think there's some interesting research going on there that Caroline was doing as part of her project. And the third component is to look at the phenomenology of the experience. And in order to do that, Caroline set up a registry, a dream registry, and people were free to submit accounts of their dreams to this. And then she was able later to analyze those dreams to see whether there were differences in the kinds of features that they had, the qualitative elements, between dreams that were later described as being precognitive of an event, ones that didn't turn out to be precognitive of anything at all, and ones which at the time didn't feel special, but retrospectively maybe were thought to have a precognitive component. And in analysing those data phenomenologically, so looking at the features and seeing whether they seem to cluster within one category over the others, she found that there were no real differences, that they seemed to be rather idiosyncratic. What might be true for one person wouldn't necessarily be true for another person. And so in that way, we can't really use that as a guide to distinguish between dreams that are maybe a little bit disturbing but are apropos nothing in particular, and those dreams which maybe are a little bit disturbing and on which we maybe should actually act, or that we should pay more attention to. So that kind of reflects the ethos then of Caroline's research and the KPU more generally, that it's open to particularly experimental work, but is also interested in richer, more qualitative approaches, particularly survey-based and kind of content analysis or feature-based accounts. Not qualitative in the sense perhaps that I will mean later on. Pete, by contrast, as I mentioned before, is a trained historian, and so his work is predominantly historical in nature, and he's explored in particular the interface between psychical research, parapsychological phenomena, and also our understanding of the psychology of magic. He's very clear in some of his writings that there isn't really scope for a distinct discipline or sub-discipline, which is the science of magic or the psychology of magic. That doesn't make any sense, but nevertheless there may be some features that transpose from one side to another. His book I can highly recommend on D.D. Hume, the first psychic, is his analysis of the original records of D.D. Hume's phenomena, which occurred before the establishment of the SPR, although some of the founders of the SPR back in 1882 had sat with D.D. Hume in that previous period. And his interests are rather eclectic and esoteric, but they revolve around those esoteric or paranormal types of beliefs and their relation with parapsychology. Caroline also is co-editor, importantly and influentially, of probably the main textbook in parapsychology at the moment, certainly at undergraduate level, which is Harvey Owen and Hare's Introduction to Parapsychology. which I would recommend. So that gives you a sense of the kind of work that's going on at the KPU. They currently have PhD students, 2 to my knowledge at the moment, and I'm sure they'd be interested to hear from you if you were looking for an opportunity to study. The next research centre is somewhat distinct from the KPU approach because Robin Woofett's interest really predates it. Robin, when I was a PhD student at Edinburgh, was a fairly frequent visitor to Edinburgh. He knew colleagues there, and he spent quite a bit of time with Bob Morris at that time. And I can't help but think that his interest was maybe cultivated through those encounters. He has established an Anomalous Experience Research Unit, ERU, at the University of York. Note this is in the Sociology department, whereas most of the units that we'll be talking about in this talk are based within Psychology. Professor Woofett is the lead, so he would be the contact person with them. And their centre was established to research into the context, characteristics, and consequences of experiences which suggest anomalous psychological processes and agencies and exceptional states of consciousness. Phew. So let's unpack that a little bit. There's quite a contrast between the approach that Robin takes and those undertaken at Edinburgh, in that Robin is particularly interested in discourse and language. His primary tool is to use conversation analysis, so to analyse the way in which people construct the things that they say, and to scrutinise the social work that's done by saying things the way that we say them. I highly recommend both of his books. His first book, Telling Tales of the Unexpected, for example, one of the main discoveries there is the way in which people work when describing their paranormal experiences to others. They work very hard to normalise those experiences and to normalise themselves as experiences. So they will situate their experience in a very mundane and normal setting, one that shows that they are a common and garden type of person, that ordinarily quite rational and reasoned and rather dispassionate when it comes to paranormal phenomena. They're not the kind of person who has these kind of experiences all the time, but nevertheless, something like this happened to me. And what he found was, pardon me, when people were describing their experiences, they would typically begin by setting them in a very mundane context. I was just doing the dishes when all of a sudden I had this thought. And in saying that first component, its purpose was to establish themselves as somebody who's quite impartial, quite neutral, very much the same as the listener, that had similar goals and feelings and experiences about the world. And that allowed them to help to normalise the experience that was going to follow, which was rather stark and unusual. It was at that time when I was doing dishes when suddenly I saw this object levitate, and it was the first time that I experienced poltergeist phenomena in my house, and the phenomena increased from that point onwards, that kind of a framing. And I think Robin has been responsible for supervising a number of students, all of whom share that kind of orientation, very much looking at the discursive aspects of people's experiences, how they share those experiences with others, and how they negotiate those experiences, and the understanding that that can give us into phenomena. So over time, that has reshifted, reoriented from spontaneous experience to cultivated experience, particularly in the seance room or on platform in mediumistic demonstrations. So, for example, one of his students, Hannah Gilbert, her PhD was on the articulation of communications by mediums and the dyadic interaction with the recipients, the person in the congregation for whom the message was intended. Again, the focus here is not so much on demonstrating the veracity of the messages. It's not about proving that the communication is some discarnate entity or that the communications are true in any kind of ontological sense. It's much more about how are those communications constructed and how does that construction do social work? How does it present it as an act of persuasion? And others who've worked with the group similarly adopt this kind of social perspective. Pardon me, I didn't have a cough when I started. And as I say, it very much reflects an orientation which is sociological and language oriented. I think it's been very good for parapsychology as well, because it's enabled parapsychology to be discussed in other fora. So in sociological settings, in conversation analysis settings, as common or garden, as not particularly controversial or contentious, just a legitimate subject area for investigation. And I think that's a really important service that he's provided. He's also explored the dyadic interaction between experimenters and participants in parapsychology experiments to look at how they might help to structure or order that interaction. And again, I think that work is really important, although maybe fairly typically the media got the wrong end of the stick for that and presumed that what he was trying to do was to explain away phenomena by explaining how they could be explained as only due to bias or influence through that interaction, and that wasn't the agenda whatsoever. Somebody who's not listed here that I've realised after I've sent the slides to Nancy is Tamlin Ryan, who has a really fascinating PhD that's completed, which is an autoethnographic study where she herself trained to be an online psychic who offered readings to people via the internet, and her PhD is the journey of that self-discovery, that process of development that she went through. Autoethnography is a wonderful tool. We're starting to use it also at Northampton now, and provides a really fascinating insight into process. Again, it sets to one side issues around proof, that really when we're communicating things, no matter how reassuring or impressive they are to the clients, we don't necessarily know the source of that information, whether it's our own unconscious, whether at some subtle level we're fooling ourselves even, or whether it truly does come from some parapsychological, paranormal source. Those things are set, those things are bracketed. They're set to one side, and that allows you to focus wholly on the process itself. So Robin's other book, The Language of Mediums and Psychics, reflects that process that I was talking about, this kind of dyadic nature between the medium and the recipient, the intended recipient. And again, I recommend it, although I just recently checked on Amazon, and I think it's currently retailing for about £5 UK. So maybe you want to look to borrow it from your local library rather than purchase a copy. Again, you can check out more about the group that is still very strong, still very active at the University of York, if you just search for the Anomalous Experience Research Unit. I'm kind of moving geographically down the country, down the east coast at the moment, and our next stop then is at the University of Derby, where we find Ian Baker. Ian Baker has established at Derby a Psychology of Paranormal Phenomena group, made up primarily of people who previously didn't have any direct or official relation with parapsychology or psychical research. So this is a real boon that he's been able to interest colleagues, kind of neutral, but what would you say, kind of undecided colleagues, to explore this area more seriously. And if you check out the website, there's a collective now of about 6 people, mainly consisting of established staff members who are actively pursuing this as a research agenda in various ways. Ian's own, and Ian also has managed to introduce a module into the undergraduate program, again as part of the psychology program, that looks at anomalistic psychology and parapsychology. Now, it's maybe worthwhile at this point differentiating between those two. It'll kind of set things up when we talk about for when we talk about Chris French's work. And parapsychology is the more rounded approach to such phenomena that maybe is reflected by the approach of places like Edinburgh, where we take people's experiences seriously, we explore normal explanations and see how far we can go with them, but we remain open to the idea that in fact we may need to introduce some new constructs to psychological and scientific nomenclature, because there is a solid foundation to the notion of ESP or psychokinesis, etc. Anomalistic psychology does not tend to take that view. It tends to presume that all paranormal phenomena will ultimately be explicable in conventional psychological terms. And so it's very much oriented around that. It's got a fairly long history going back to the 1970s. The Psychology of Anomalous Experience, Graham Reed's book, and Anomalistic Psychology by Zusny and Jones are very early books in that area. And what they did was they introduced us to phenomena within psychology that might be applied to certain kinds of paranormal experience, such as, for example, apparitional experiences and what we know about the normal action of perceptual psychology, that kind of thing. So Ian's course covers both of those. Starts with Anomalistic, sees what remains to be understood, and uses that to introduce parapsychology. Ian's own background is particularly in psychophysiological approaches, so understanding bodily reactions to stimuli of various sorts and seeing how that might apply when those stimuli seem to be extrasensory. So he has a strong grounding in methods of psychophysiology. He spent some time working within conventional psychophysiology laboratories, and he's particularly used measures like electrodermal activity, which measures skin resistance and is a measure of arousal or anxiety, and is a very good indicator of overall emotional state, and is very responsive to various kinds of stimuli. If we clap our hands behind somebody's back, we would see a spike in our EDA or electrodermal activity. If we whisper a meaningful name to somebody, we'll see a response which will be different for a name that they do know from one that they don't know, and so on. So it's quite a direct tell, and sometimes there can be a mismatch between our physiology and our conscious responses, and typically it's the physiology which is more truthful. So there may be something in that. And Ian's interest in particular has been to see whether physiologically we respond to being stared at by others, even under circumstances where we have no conscious awareness that other people are staring at us. So this so-called staring detection research, and also some people call it DMILS, which is direct mental interaction with living systems research, that kind of maps onto this idea that perhaps sometimes we are aware of information from our environment, which maybe shapes or moderates our behavior in subtle ways, maybe shapes our decision making, but not in a way that bubbles through to consciousness. And so we're not actively aware that we know something, but we're still acting on that information. And so Ian's work in particular has been, for example, to measure people's EEG and to measure their brain states, their brain activity, and also their EDA, and to see whether those responses differ under conditions when people are actively looking at them through CCTV and other situations when nobody's looking at them, randomly selected. And this is his mainstream area, and certainly he's still the go-to guy in the UK when it comes to any psychophysiological research. And certainly if you're interested in that area, I would speak to him. But he's also got a very strong interest in field investigations, and with others that I'll mention later, Kieran O'Keefe, he's been very concerned to ensure that academic standards are applied to amateur groups around the country. So he's been very diligent in providing guidelines for people on appropriate practice when it comes to following up on an apparitional case or a poltergeist case, and in particular focusing on the ethics of such situations. Now, how can we ensure that the best interests of the experience are served by the investigation that we're undertaking? It's reminiscent of Scott Rogo's so-called investigator's dilemma. Scott Rogo was a very popular writer, but also an active researcher up to, I think, the mid-80s, early 80s certainly. And he described the investigator's dilemma as being a situation in which a researcher hears about something like a poltergeist case occurring to a family, and the family are very distressed by that experience. The researcher's natural instinct is to want to cultivate the phenomena, to be on site and to witness as many of those phenomena under controlled conditions as they can. And Rogo was very clear that their first obligation is to the experience. And if they're distressed by these phenomena, and if there's anything we can do to help those phenomena go away, to dissipate, then that's going to be our first act. And Ian is kind of following up on that a little bit in providing guidelines. He's got, I think, quite close links to a group in the UK called ASAP, the Association for the, I know I shouldn't have tried to guess what ASAP stood for, the study of anomalous paranormal phenomena, something like that, ASAP is, but ASSAP, which is a very legitimate kind of network group in the UK who are particularly interested in spontaneous cases and field investigations, and it's worth checking out with them. And also Ian is supervising a PhD student, Malcolm Davidson, and Malcolm's project, Malcolm Schofield, sorry, and Malcolm's PhD is looking at the relationship between religious, spiritual and paranormal beliefs. And it's through that little snowballing effect, by gathering interest from colleagues and cultivating PhD students, that you start to get a group that's got critical mass and productivity starts to increase much more rapidly after that. As we move down the East Coast, we now come to London, and there are two centres in London that I wanted to mention to you. One of those is Chris French's group at Goldsmiths University, and that's called the Anomalistic Psychology Research Unit. Chris French is a noted skeptic, so he is minded to believe that these phenomena are not genuine, that there are legitimate conventional explanations for them. He is co-author of a book, Anomalistic Psychology, which espouses that position. But importantly, he is not an entrenched skeptic. He is very open to the idea that the evidence may accumulate and he may need to revise his opinion. And he is actually relatively impressed by the quality of at least some of the research in parapsychology in comparison with, for example, what's happening in mainstream social science, and is not afraid to say so publicly. So he is, I think, an ally of parapsychology on, for example, things like Wikipedia wars, because he is a respected skeptic who has explicitly said a lot of this research is very solid, very well conducted, and is very difficult to explain away. It's not trivial. He interestingly runs an undergraduate program, and there's an anomalistic psychology course as part of that psychology degree. They also have an invited speakers series, so if you're able to visit London or you're in London or nearby, it's very well worth finding out about it. They get some very good high-profile speakers, and they're open to others to attend. They very typically end up down in a public house somewhere near the university, and the conversations carry on there, and I would highly recommend them to you. Very broad-based though, so it's very much the paranormal very generally, rather than a very narrow understanding of parapsychology that they look at there. His research reflects that wide range of anomalistic psychology, so very much interested in understanding memory effects, perceptual effects, and so on. One of his PhD students, for example, Louis Sava, he focused on some of those, but he has supervised other people. Itai Ipsan, for example, whose research was on divination. So he's been very open to working with people who are much less skeptical in the kind of sense of already having decided that the phenomena are not genuine. He's happy to work with those people and support their projects. He's very interested in explanations of anomalous experiences, particularly in terms of things like sleep paralysis. So one subclass of phenomena, including particularly things like alien abduction experiences, some spirit visitation type experiences, might be readily explicable in terms of the standard phenomena of sleep paralysis. Sleep paralysis is the dislocation of two systems, effectively. So just as we have people who sleepwalk, I'll trace back. So in the normal state, when we go asleep and start to dream, as we're actively dreaming, so our experience is internally generated, but it's rich and vivid, and we feel like we're an actor participating in a scene rather than simply thinking about or mindlessly daydreaming about something. While that is going on, our body is paralyzed in order that we can't act out those experiences that we're acting within in our dreams. Now, with something like sleepwalking, those two processes get dislocated, so people are still in a dream state, but they're now not paralyzed any longer, and there's a danger as they move around the house. They are acting out what they think is happening in their dream, but that's not really what's happening at all. And that can have dangerous, or at the very least embarrassing, consequences for people. But sleep paralysis seems to be the reverse of that. Sleep paralysis seems to be the situation in which the paralysis component is retained, but we're no longer fast asleep and concentrating on our internally generated imagery, but rather we're going through a hypnopompic state where we're slowly waking up, and our experience is a mixture of internally generated imagery, but also things that are truly around us. So we might suddenly be aware of our bedroom, or we might see an apparitional figure, or we may have a sense of presence just off to the side, just out of view. We can open our eyes are not paralyzed during dreams, for example, and our eyes are free to move around. So we move our eyes around, we feel as if we're solidly paralyzed. And of course, in some situations, people if they don't know what's going on, they may interpret that in paranormal terms. He's also very interested in near-death experiences, and particularly has offered commentaries around the possibility that people's experiences are rich and vivid, but don't occur at times when their brains are incapacitated. They may be in a period of collapse when they do have some faculties still available, but particularly during the period of recovery after a resuscitation event where they're still unconscious, but they're slowly recovering their faculties, and maybe many of these near-death experiences occur during that period. And when the person recovers and wakes up and shares them with others, it's very difficult to tease those apart. So he spoke quite widely on it. Crucially for a skeptic, and Richard Wiseman also falls into this category, he has actively tested some of the claims of parapsychology, most notably testing for telephone telepathy, following up on some of Rupert Sheldrake's research, looking to see whether people can truly tell who's at the end of the phone when the phone rings, to a level that goes beyond simple inference or using other cues. You know, certain people might be more likely to phone at certain times of the day, for example. So something like that. He was also quite famously involved in a replication attempt of one of Daryl Bem's parapsychology effects called the retroactive facilitation of recall. So this is a situation in which Daryl Bem took some standard psychology experiments and twisted them so that if people were successful, they could only be successful if they were able to precognize, so be precognitive about information that lay in their future. So with facilitation of recall, the way that that works is rather odd, but when I mention this to our undergraduates, it's maybe offers them an out if they have exams coming up and they can't cram all their revision in time, because it suggests that if you give people some material to learn, so say a set of words that flash up on screen, one after another, so a very standard memory test, and then after that you give them a recall test, and they have to recall as many of the words as they can remember, and once they've given their recall, you then give them a chance to practice, to try and memorize some of the words that form part of the test. Well, that should have no effect. You've already had your recall test. It's too late for it to give you any benefit. But in fact, Daryl Bem found that there was an advantage. If you give people some of those words to practice later on, it seems to enable them to better remember words in a test that's already taken place. So this thoroughly bonkers idea, I'm sorry if you've not come across it before, and that very brief account is a little bit too hurried to be clear, do check out the phrase retroactive facilitation of recall and find out more about it. But this bonkers idea actually seems to empirically work in practice. That people, if they have a memory test now, can improve their recall of material by revising that material after they've taken the test. Well, Chris famously was part of a team of three, a group Stuart Ritchie at Edinburgh and Richard Wiseman with the others, who attempted replications of that and failed to replicate. And there was quite a furore about that. Features in the Psychologist, for example, about replication and so on. Very interesting feature that we could talk about some other time, or as a quick plug, you might want to check out a talk I gave to the BPS Transpersonal section, which was recorded and is on YouTube. And I can find a link for that later on if you're interested in that, where I'm talking about the kind of the background to those replications and the reaction to them. So that's kind of work that Chris French has been doing. The other person who's based in London that I wanted to tell you about is David Luke. So he is a graduate of ours at Northampton. His PhD project was supervised by Deborah Delanoy and Simon Sherwood. Incidentally, before when I mentioned all those people who had been supervised by Bob Morris, I should also have mentioned the very important service provided by Deborah and by John Beloff, who co-supervised quite a number of those students and also provided that dynamic research environment within which people worked. They're a really important part of that group and community. So I should have mentioned Deborah earlier. David is developing his research group at the University of Greenwich in London. They hosted the Parapsychological Association conference earlier in 2015 this year. And he offers a third-year option on parapsychology, transpersonal psychology, and anomalistic psychology. So he's fitting quite a lot in there in the one program. He's bringing to himself a number of students, graduate students who are working with him, and they have a variety of interests. Most obviously, David is known for his interest in altered states of consciousness and anomalous psychological phenomena, particularly the use of various psychedelics, entheogens, so concoctions that are intended to induce transpersonal states that allow people to access alternative realities, particularly those associated with shaman. And many of his books, for example, he's got chapters and he co-edits Talking with Spirits, and he co-organizes the Breaking Convention event, which reflect this focus on the relationship between psychedelics and our perception of the nature of the world and our access to other capabilities, to alternative perceptions. And a lot of his work involves field investigations, particularly in South America, working with various cultures that are shamanic in nature, and looking at the effects of various hallucinogenics and psychedelics and the kinds of spiritual experiences they can produce. That runs from the phenomenology of those experiences through to experimental work, where you see whether people in such states are able to fare better at a standard or classic ESP type experiment as well. He's also obviously related to that is the neuroscience of such experiences. So how are these psychedelics working? How do they operate on the brain? What are the conventional operations within the brain that might be related then to a psychic faculty? And this is his linkage with the transpersonal psychology community. And he was a keynote at the BPS Transpersonal Conference last year as well. So building links with that community as well. And going back to his PhD work, he is very interested in the in individual differences and the social psychology of beliefs about luck and magic and the paranormal in the regular population. So among ordinary people who have things happen to them, maybe on occasion they conceive of the good things that happen that may be psi determined as simply being lucky, being fortunate. And he's one of the people who suggested, along with people like Rex Stanford, that maybe it isn't an appropriate question to ask people before an experiment, are you somebody who thinks of yourself as psychic, so much as to ask people, are you somebody who thinks of themselves as fortunate? Do things tend to work out right for you? When you have to make decisions which are somewhat 50-50 in your life, do you tend to choose correctly? Do things tend to work out for you in ways that suggest that you're lucky? Those more subtle kind of eventualities, those are the ones that seem to be more interesting and might reflect the natural operation of psi, which may be fundamentally unconscious. So David's very interested in that. I'll say more about that when I talk about some of our work at Northampton in a little bit. And he's also working with Goran Brusewitz of the Swedish SPR, who's undertaking a PhD with David, and working with Adrian Ryan as well at the University of Gothenburg. And they're very interested in apparent telepathic experiences that are shared by twins. So it's got a range of interests there. He is co-author of the Anomalistic Psychology book, along with Chris French and Nicola Holt and Christine Simmons-Moore. So again, a very strong group there who can trace their heritage, their lineage back to Bob Morris. So I hope that's fairly clear. Sorry, Adrian Parker, not Adrian Ryan. I do apologise. That's quite right. Adrian Parker is co-supervising Goran Brusewitz's project. Adrian Ryan is London-based and is doing some completely different but very interesting work, particularly looking at geomagnetism and local sidereal time and various environmental effects upon psychic experience. I wanted to mention Bucks New University because it represents the reintroduction really to the fold of people who were really quite productive within parapsychology for some time. Career and things have gotten in the way and they're kind of coming back into the fold a little bit. And this is Kieran O'Keefe and Matt Smith, who are both now based at Bucks New University. And you'll see where that is on the map. And their work is oriented around positive psychology rather than transpersonal psychology or parapsychology. And I think this shift in nomenclature isn't something suspicious. I think it's something to be applauded, because what it shows is that parapsychology isn't this rather odd, unusual thing that bears no relation to anything else going on in mainstream psychology, but in fact it shares interfaces or clear overlaps with a number of other distinct areas. Transpersonal psychology being one, consciousness studies being another, and positive psychology being a third. So there's a great interest here, for example, in the relationship between various spiritual practices and well-being, in understanding anomalous experiences and placing those in a positive psychology setting. So there are some really good links there, I think. Their backgrounds reflect a number of areas. Matt also has in the past been interested in the psychology of luck. His background is predominantly experimental parapsychology. His main contributions, I think, have been through experimental work, particularly looking at various forms of ESP. He's especially been interested in things like expectancy effects and experimenter effects. So can the experimenter that you interact with affect the outcome of your study? There seems to be evidence from parapsychology that some trials are more successful than others in a way that reflects the enthusiasm or motivation or expectations of the researchers rather than necessarily the expectations and motivations of the participants themselves. And we can look at the ways in which that might be communicated from one to the other. But there's also among both of these guys, there's a strong interest in mediumship and in haunting investigations. One way in which that has reflected itself is in their media profile. They've both been associated with a very popular TV show in the UK called Most Haunted, in which people conducted field investigations live on TV, and they cultivated a very large audience. These are very populist, they're very entertainment oriented, but they can serve a purpose. They do provide an opportunity to educate a large number of people about basic standards of evidence, for example. They can introduce people to standard alternative explanations and cause people to maybe reflect a little bit more critically on their own experiences. So I think it is an important thing that some researchers do, and some of their publications reflect that. So they've written about haunting investigations and about mediumship. And Matt Smith is looking to get involved in a project that we're conducting at Northampton, where we're cultivating links with the mediumistic community in the UK and looking to collaborate on future projects. So watch this space for some of that work in the future. So this is a developing unit. They're very young at the moment. They're in a position to supervise PhD students. They've supervised master's projects within their MSc Positive Psychology, which are very much around the phenomenology and experiences of mediums, so are very open to the idea of parapsychological experiences as part of what they do. And finally, for this whistle stop, I'm going to say a little bit about the work that we're doing at Northampton. I'll just give you a flavour of the different projects that are going on with us here. The key researchers here are myself and Liz Roxburgh, a close colleague of mine, and we and others are part of the Centre for the Study of Anomalous Psychological Processes, which is rather a mouthful. This is a centre that was established in 2000. The founders of the centre were myself and Deborah Delanoy and Simon Sherwood back then, and again it's with thanks to Deborah and Simon for all the hard work in those early years in allowing the centre to become established, and it's still recognised by the university as a centre of research excellence, so we get some support for that in terms of infrastructure and recognition. At Northampton we also have a third year option on parapsychology and anomalous experience that our third year students can take. That may be the longest continuously running programme now. This is now its 20th year this year, and at the moment it's a 20-week course, so we're able to funnel in an awful lot of material over 20 weeks, 20 one-hour lectures and 10 one-hour seminars our students get, and it's very popular. Figures have ranged between a time when it was capped at 100 and figures for this year around about 55. On a normal year our figures are anywhere between about 50 and 70. So it's a very popular course, and it enhances critical thinking. That's a real core element to this. There's no corporate view about the phenomena, and main focus is very much on encouraging students to think for themselves, to engage with primary sources, and to develop their own opinion, their own view, based on their own critical faculties and the background that reading that they do. We also have An MS, we have had an MSc in transpersonal psychology, but now that's subsumed in a generic MSc psychology. But within that, people can take a specialist option in transpersonal psychology and parapsychology, and can undertake a dissertation in the subject area with a number of people to supervise. So there's lots of scope to cover that kind of material. I think the CSAP web pages are down at the minute from the website because they're being redeveloped. We're going through yet another structure review for the university. We're shifting from 6 schools to 4 faculties, and so a lot of things are being revised at the moment. But we'll still be there, and we're still hopefully contactable. So I want to tell you a little bit about the kind of research that we're conducting. Before I do that, I want to introduce you to the team. So Northampton probably is the largest research group at the moment in terms of bodies, in terms of number of people who are involved. This is a variety of people who are either faculty members, so tenured members of staff, or they're PhD students, or they're employed on research projects as research assistants. So among the tenured staff, and this is a bit complicated, but we have myself and Liz down here. This is us outside the Arthur Findlay College, the Centre for the Spiritualist National Union in the UK. And our colleague here, this is Rachel Evenden. She's also a lecturer at the university who's got a training as a psychotherapist, teaches particularly in our psychotherapy programs, and is very interested in the interface between psychotherapy and psychological well-being and anomalous experiences, both as they occur spontaneously to people, for example, people who are bereaved or who have unusual spiritual crises, for example, but also among people who have a background in paranormal experience, such as mediums, and the therapeutic work that they can do. So she's looking at it. And our other colleagues are over here. These also supervise some of the PhD projects. So Alistair Gordon Finlayson is an ordained Buddhist monk. His interest is in transpersonal psychology, and in particular Buddhist studies, and is very interested particularly in spiritual practices and their overlap with spiritual experience and psychological well-being. Helen Clegg here is an evolutionary psychologist, and she's particularly interested in the kind of evolutionary or biological bases of experience, and she's collaborating on a number of projects that look at effectively kind of the neuroscience of people's experiences. And this is my favourite picture of Graham Smith. He's a very sceptical member of the group. He's a cognitive psychologist and perceptual psychologist by training, and he's co-supervising a number of projects in the spirit of kind of academic freedom. He's rather sceptical for these effects, but he's very willing to supervise and look to be persuaded otherwise. We also have a number of PhD students, and I'll tell you more about their work hopefully through the following slides. We have David Saunders over here, and Cal Cooper, whose name may be familiar to some of you. Perhaps David Saunders also. He gave a PF talk last year too. And then up here we have Kim Sheffield. We've got Shami Sonex. We've got Louise King or Lou King. We've got Chetak Nangari. And the newest addition to our group is here, and this is Alex Wilson. He's only joined us in the middle of January, and I don't have a kind of a photo of him apart from him pursuing his main hobby, which is that he's a semi-professional basketball player. So this is him scoring a basket. Sorry if that's the wrong term, but I've taken that from his webpage. So he's recently joined us, and they've got a variety of interests that I'll explore in a few minutes. And up here we have 4 of our students who are either final year undergraduates or they're graduated students. They're on master's programs, and they're okay, so I've got to watch the time here. I should wind up in about 10 minutes, I promise. So the RAs up here then are working on funded projects, and this has been really important to me, is to find fairly modest amounts of funding that enable people to have their first taste of actual research, following the research cycle from the conception of an idea, being co-bidders on a funding bid, and then being research assistants on the project, seeing it through conclusion, and then dissemination at conferences and publishing papers. Sometimes that's wonderfully successful, and people feel enthused by that and stick around despite the adversity of trying to get funding in an area as difficult as parapsychology. And the examples of that are people like Cal Cooper, Sophie Drennan, who's not on here anymore, but she's not listed on here only because she successfully defended her thesis in the summer and now has her PhD, so she's no longer there. And Glenn Hitchman, who is a graduate student. He got his PhD with us at Northampton and has moved on, but his first exposure was in collaborating on these small externally funded projects. And we're hoping for something similar for these guys up here. So that's the team. I'll just tell you a little bit about the kind of things they've been up to before I hopefully open things up for questions. So we've got a strong thread which is qualitative in nature. So we're very interested in people's subjective experiences. It's very ideographic. It's quite deep and rich. It sacrifices the capacity to generalize to others in return for an opportunity to understand people's lived experience from their perspective in a way that we feel is beneficial to other people to have that experience shared and analysed. We're interested in things like accounts of spontaneous experience. So some of that work, for example, has been working with clients who are undergoing therapy, for example, for their experiences. So Cal Cooper's project is very interested in the process of bereavement that people go through. And as part of that, he has interviewed people who during that bereavement process, when they've lost somebody they're close to, they've had apparitional type experiences that they've interpreted as the continuing presence of that loved one. And Cal's, through that interview, very delicately and sensitively trying to tease out the impact of that experience for them and how that continuing thread has allowed them to get on with their material life with that person not physically there. Rachel, as I say, has done some similar work looking at clients' experiences in therapeutic settings to see how those are respected and honoured by the therapists, how they're framed and understood within that experience. Working particularly closely with Liz Roxburgh, we've been very interested in the phenomenology of mediumship, and this is particularly to understand how it is that we have a group of people who have experiences which in other circumstances would be pathologized. They see things that other people don't see, they hear voices that they claim they don't generate themselves, and at times those voices compel them to do things or to say things to other people, and yet these people are not pathological. In fact, the reverse is true. In our own survey work, we found that mediums actually present as psychologically healthier than the average person. And so a lot of our phenomenological work is to understand how they understand their experiences, how they frame those experiences, how they derive meaning from them, and how that helps them to maintain that one step in another world and one step in this world. A classic example of that is, for example, how they understand the control that they have over hearing voices from their spirit control, for example, or from deceased persons, so that these occur when they're on platform giving a demonstration, or while they're sitting with a client during a private sitting, but not when they're in Morrison's doing their shopping. You know, how do they control that in a way that others who hear voices are unable to? So we're very interested in it. And there's very clear linkages with the clinical parapsychology movement that others may tell you about. Mario in particular, there's a very strong movement in France looking at clinical parapsychology, also Germany and in the Netherlands. And there's a strong interest in the UK too in counselling for anomalous experiences, in legitimizing those experiences in the sense of making them a legitimate focus for discussion rather than necessarily verifying the experience understanding of their source or their meaning. So I mentioned the bereavement process and Cal's work. Counsellors' needs in dealing with anomalous experiences is very important to us, and also the role of the temporal lobe in understanding anomalous experiences. And here I'm particularly thinking about Lou King, and her work is looking at people who experience temporal lobe epilepsy, and when they're having seizures, the experiences they have during that period can very often be have spiritual attributions. They can give them a glimpse of heaven, for example. And Lou, as somebody who has those experiences herself, is interested to find out more about other people's meaning making. How do they make sense of those experiences? Phenomenologically, what is that like? And how do we share that with the larger professional community so they have a better empathy and understanding of that experience? And we're also interested more broadly in altered states of consciousness and anomalous experiences. We have some interest that's developing now with Alex in the use of psychedelics, particularly for social purposes in the UK, but also spiritually, and the experiences that they might produce, but also through spiritual practice. Kim, for example, and Chetak are both looking at different forms of meditation practice and looking at the experiences people have through meditation and the impact that those experiences have for their understanding of themselves and their nature of reality and so on. And that's where that comes in. So we have a lot of qualitative work that's going on at the moment, but we also have experimental approaches that we're interested in, and we have a variety of those. So we're very interested in non-conscious ESP. And I'll give an illustration of this in a few moments. And this is situations in which maybe people are acting on information that they've acquired through some extrasensory means, but they have no conscious awareness that they have that information. So I'll explain what I mean by that. But it fits very much in the mold of the work of people like Matt Smith and of David Luke, looking at the psychology of luck and people just being quite fortunate in the way that things work out for them, that when they've done certain things or made certain decisions, life has tended to just fall their way. Related to that is projects looking at things like morphic resonance, which again reflect that non-conscious ESP. So I've got a slide to explain what we're doing when it comes to morphic resonance. But we're also interested in altered states of consciousness and their relationship with spontaneous experiences of ESP. And so a lot of our controlled experimental work has been of dream ESP and of something called Ganzfeld stimulation. And finally, we're particularly focusing on remote viewing more recently. So let's have a quick look at those. Again, a very potted account, but I'm very happy to refer you to some of the publications and earlier talks that I've given where I talk about these in a lot more detail. So for non-conscious ESP, one of the things we're interested in is Rupert Sheldrake's idea of morphic resonance. So Sheldrake suggests that at times when people are acquiring a new skill, when they're learning something new, they can benefit from the fact that previous generations have toiled and sweated to acquire that information, to go through that learning process. And so it's easier to learn things that other conspecifics, other people who are members of the same species as us, have had to go through before, than it is to learn something that's completely new. And so we operationalized that and said, well, if Sheldrake's ideas of morphic resonance are true, then one prediction might be that if we present people with a learning paradigm, they'll find it easier to learn Chinese symbols that are genuine Chinese symbols that generations of Chinese people have actually learned and have redrawn through history. They'll memorize those symbols much more easily than symbols that we've invented, the Chinese equivalent of nonsense jumbles of letters. So what we've done in our studies is we've presented participants with a memory task where they're presented with symbols like this one. They look at these on screen, they flash on screen for about 2 seconds, and they experience about 20 of them, and they simply have to try and memorize as many of them as they can. Some of them, such as this one, are genuine Chinese symbols, others are not. They've been created for us by a friend who is a native Chinese speaker, and she's created them for us using the principles of Chinese grammar as it comes to these idioforms. After these, we give people a distractor task so they can't sit there trying to memorize them. And in our case, we've got a fun little task, which is the paper, scissors, stone task, where you go 1, 2, 3, and you have to shape your hand as either paper, scissors, or a stone. And your opponent does the same, and one of you wins or loses. So here we've got scissors and scissors, so that's a draw. But if this person had made the shape of a stone, then the stone would win because the stone blunts scissors. And if they'd made the shape of paper, then the scissors would win because scissors can cut paper. So this is very well known in the UK. It's quite a fun little task. People engage with that and they forget that they're supposed to have remembered the symbols. And then we show them pairs of symbols, one of which they were exposed to previously and one of which is completely new. That's a decoy. And they have to indicate which of those they've seen before, if either. Some trials neither has been seen before, and they rate their confidence in having seen those. So that's the kind of task that we have here, where we want to see whether they in fact do tend to remember more effectively genuine symbols than invented symbols across a number of participants. The fun with this is it's measuring a paranormal phenomenon, morphic resonance, but through a very standard psychological technique, a standard experimental method, which should be uncontroversial. We're not really giving it any kind of a twist. And then the other task that we're using is the one that David Luke has developed, which is kind of a hidden psi task. And in this task, we recruit people to take part in an ESP test. And to begin with, what they simply have to do is say, well, we need to find out a little bit about your preferences, first of all. So what we want you to do on these first trials is just pick out the image that you like the best. Which do you find most attractive? So they look at these, and these have been chosen to be equally attractive to people, and they click on one that they pick as their favorite, and they go through a sequence of 10 of these just to get a bearing, to get a gauging of their natural preferences, their natural likings. But aha, here's the twist. In fact, that turns out to have been their psychic task. That after they've made their selection, the computer's randomly chosen one of those to be an ESP target, and every time they've matched up their preference with the actual target, that counts as a hit. And every time they haven't, it counts as a miss. It's really nice because at the time of the task, the participant doesn't realize that they're doing an ESP task at all. So all of the kind of skepticism, all the fear elements that might be associated with being psychic, hopefully are not present. And then what we want to do is to reinforce that behavior in a way that, again, doesn't signal that they've just done an ESP task. So we count up how many hits they got, and we compare it with chance expectation. And if they score more hits than we'd expect by chance expectation, the computer naturally then gives them a pleasant task to do. So in this case, they get to look at Gary Larson cartoons, and they have to say which of the cartoons is funnier than which do they prefer. If they perform worse than we'd expect by chance, they're given a really dull, boring task to do, and in our case, we get them to monitor numbers that randomly appear on screen, and they have to press a space bar every time they get a sequence of 3 odd numbers or a sequence of 3 even numbers. On exit, we ask people how much they enjoyed the task, and lo and behold, they quite like this task, although unfortunately not as much as if we just let them out early. And when they rate this task, they really don't like doing this, and the longer they have to do it, the less they like it. And what we found, collaborating with David across a sequence of studies, is that more people end up in this condition than we should expect by chance. So more people get to do the fun task than we should expect by chance alone, even though in this study people are not aware that they're exercising any psychic ability at all. So those are kind of the fun things that we're doing with non-conscious ESP. In the final couple of minutes, I'm just going to explain briefly how we look at altered states of consciousness in some of our work. Some of this probably doesn't need much retelling because it's quite similar to the work that Caroline's doing up at Edinburgh, in that people sleep typically at home in their own beds. They're not EEG monitored as here. This is a kind of what you call a library picture, but they would sleep at home, and while they're at home, the computer would randomly choose a target for them and would play that target for them overnight, and then we look to see whether their dreams are related to that target, again by presenting them to an independent judge who actually not only looks at the target but looks at decoys as well, and has to look at the degree of correspondence between each of them. Again, what we're looking to see is whether the judge is able to pick out the target more often than we'd expect by chance. Chance level again is typically 25%. And when Simon Sherwood and I reviewed a range of studies of that sort, we found that there was a highly significant effect. That in dream ESP studies, people were generating dream imagery that better related to the target than it did to any of the decoys. There probably isn't enough time to describe the Ganzfeld technique to you. Suffice it to say that what we have is a technique here that allows us to introduce a kind of a dreamy, dreamlike state in people during normal working hours, so people can come along to the lab. We play white noise to the face, and although they're wide awake, they I will finish up, Nancy. I'm just getting to the end here. They enter a kind of a woozy, hypnagogic kind of state, and then we're very interested in their impressions there. So we've done a number of studies of that sort as well. Typically in our studies, we've started to use these. We've started to use as our targets real life locations. So it looks a little bit more like remote viewing as a technique. And we use Google Earth to do that because it's got two advantages. One is the location's very attractive, quite sexy looking places, maybe places people have never been before that they'd like to visit. So here we're in the heart of Rome suddenly. But with Google Earth, you're able to interrogate the location as well. You can zoom in and look at it from different directions. You can click on these icons and see some of the photos that people have taken when they visited that site. And again, through this whistle-stop tour, I haven't really talked much about the evidence because I don't think it's that kind of talk. It was much more about approaches. But I did just want to finish with a couple of examples of trials from our own studies conducted quite recently. So one of our targets in that particular study was the Bird's Nest Stadium in Beijing. And in the remote viewing condition, people have to produce sketches and a summary. And the summary was described as a copper-surfaced statue or winged figure on a stone plinth, and this is what they drew, which we quite like in relation to this. But most importantly, we've got this image down here, and an expressionist modern building, quite large scale with fragmented surface and vertical elements. And the independent judge had no trouble at all in selecting this location among the others. And another example that is quite nice, this is from a trial which produced 2 hits from the same participant on the same day, both quite strong. And she described it as grey stones, somewhat odd-sized and odd-shaped, grainy and rough textures, feeling like a graveyard or a stone circle, involved in rituals and a place of peace and prayer. And the target for that trial was the Baha'i House of Worship in Delhi. And of course, quantitatively, that's the most important element. Overall, are we getting hit rates that are above that 25% chance level? And across a series of studies, that's what we are finding. But equally, do we get any of those kind of qualitative, in-your-face, quite pronounced trials? And some of these have been very impressive for our RAs. I'll not talk about our collaboration with the Arthur Findlay College. I'm afraid I'll have to save that for another time. And I'll end with a summary. And my summary for today is that Bob Morris's strategy, I think, has successfully led to a proliferation of research groupings around the UK. And these have conducted wide-ranging work from anomalistic psychology to tests of psychic claims and generally have been very productive. The group sizes for these centres are typically quite modest in comparison with mainstream areas, certainly in comparison with neuroscience, for example, and their long-term viability is still uncertain. But in a sense, if we live for the moment, it provides an opportunity to provide a home and shelter for people who might be the next generation. And so for now, they do offer an excellent opportunity for the next generation to be educated and trained, at least within psychology. I hope some of that was interesting to you. If you've got any questions, I'd be very happy to take them. Thank you for your attention. That's all, folks. And I do apologise for all the coughing and spluttering.
Chris, can you hear me?
Yes,
I
I
don't
can
know
hear
if
you.
my mic is on. Oh, good. Okay. So questions and answers, guys. It was a terrific conversation. Post your questions in the chat box, folks.
Right, so we have our first question there, Nan, which is there some survival research at university level being done? It depends what you mean by survival research. Very little of the work currently is proof-oriented. Although there's a little bit at Northampton now that's reinvestigating older cases, particularly associated with Eileen Garrett. David Saunders is doing some work around that. I think it's much more likely that people are interested in the phenomenology of the experience and getting to understand the medium or psychic's own experience. A really important phrase for me, I've cited it in a chapter that I wrote some years ago, is that J.B. Ryan once famously said, if you want to make rabbit stew, you first have to catch a rabbit. And by that, what I take him to mean is that we need to understand the phenomenon in its natural environs before we can start to think about how to transplant it into refined situations or conditions where we can subject it to experimental test. And so it's really important for me to sit with people who are the experts, people who have these experiences and understand their experiences before we start to try and verify them from a survival perspective. Having said that, the one thing I would have talked about is the links that we're developing with the Spiritualist National Union, and we've recently established a laboratory there where we're going to actually be conducting experimental work. Yes, hopefully you can hear me. And we're going to be conducting work with mediums who are visiting the Arthur Findlay College. So that's going to be certainly the next step. Okay, so in terms of, if I deal with these questions as they come through, so Carlos is asking about what the SPR is doing with regards to grants and publishing. Well, the SPR, I think, is a very important academic body in that it does still continue to publish one of the main journals in the discipline, which is the journal, the SPR, which has got a very broad base. We're happy to consider any approach, any empirical approach. They also award grants. It's very worthwhile checking out the SPR website, and they have a research grants committee and a survival committee. The grants are modest. They might be up to perhaps £5,000 that they can offer, but it is an amount that allows maybe a small project to get off the ground. And it's exactly the kind of thing I've used to introduce new researchers into the field. So our RAs are typically on SPR grants or on PA grants and Parapsychology Foundation grants, that kind of thing. So the SPR is really important and very well worth checking out. If I look again, and the SPR's brief is also broader, so they have an annual conference, and as the journal is, so the conference is very interested in having presentations which are concerned with field investigations, concerned with case collections or individual case analyses, interviews with experience. All of that is absolutely legitimate. Thomas, yeah.
Chris Thomas was asking what you meant by phenomenology from the percipient's point of view.
So by phenomenology, we mean the subjective experience that somebody has and the meaning they attribute to that experience. And so and from the percipient's point of view means that when we're doing our qualitative work, what we want to do is to represent our participants in their own language and in their own terms. So for example, if I want to find out about what a spirit control means to a practicing medium, then it makes sense for me to ask a very short, open question and have them then elaborate in their own terms what they mean by spirit control and how they understand the nature of that spirit control. For example, whether the spirit control is genuinely a deceased person who once lived on the earth, whether they see it as an aspect of their own personality, perhaps their higher self, whether it's some kind of conglomeration of things, to allow them to describe it, and for me to really act as a facilitator to enable their voice to be heard. And it's phenomenology because it's the world as they experience it. It's not subject to verification in any way. So if somebody says that their understanding of an aura experience is that the colour purple represents this thing, and we speak to another medium, and for that medium the colour purple in an aura represents something quite different, they're not at all regarded as being contradictory. They're understood in an integrated way as part of that person's subjective experience. I hope that kind of gives a flavour of what it means, but it's very much about treating the experience as an expert and the academic as somebody who is there to sit and listen and to learn from that experience. Okay, so
we've got a couple of people typing You can
Yes.
see
So this
Gonzalo's
is, from your
question.
observation, what is the career path for the majority of people that want to do a PhD with a focus on parapsychology and anomalistic psychology? And why were they able to integrate themselves within academic institutions? I think that's a crucial question. I think it does reflect Bob Morris's philosophy, which was to make sure that people were not simply narrow specialists in parapsychology, but also had more wide-ranging skills, that they tend to inhabit interfaces or overlaps with other mainstream areas. For example, my PhD was on the psychology of psychic reading and was very focused on the cognitive psychology of normal communications and how we make sense of communications. Ian Baker's was very much concerned with psychophysiology of mediumship, of psychophysiology of people's psychology. And so in order to get his PhD, he had to develop a set of skills that would then make him attractive to work within a university department, talking about those in a mainstream way. Our own PhD students, they always, their PhDs have an element which is parapsychological, but also an element which speaks to a broader mainstream, even where that mainstream might be positive psychology or transpersonal psychology or consciousness studies. It still gives them that broader base. The other thing I would say is that pretty much all of our PhD students also have a master's qualification. And I think that also enables them to have that broader base, that they're not a very narrow specialist, but are able to research on and teach on a wider range of areas than just parapsychology. Okay, that's that's a really good question
See
about
Wendy's
attrition
question?
rates for people studying parapsychology as PhD students. There is attrition on PhD programs. In my experience, it hasn't been particularly high. I think we, for example, now have 7 students who have their PhDs through Northampton, and we only have 2 students who initially registered with us and didn't go to the full term. So that return rate is pretty healthy. I think partly the reason for that is that we're very selective, not to make sure that these people are capable of conducting PhD work. That's only part of the story. But it's also got to be that there's a good fit between the kind of expertise we have and the facilities we have and what their needs are. And sometimes people have contacted us initially and it hasn't worked into a PhD submission application because there's been a mismatch and we probably weren't best placed to support them. So I think that is really important. The biggest issues here and questions that we ask at interview are very much around people's perseverance and their commitment to this, because it is a long old slog with very few rewards along the way. Studying for a PhD in any discipline is hard work, and it's even harder when there are fewer opportunities to secure bursaries, for example, to cover basic costs and things like that. Very often, for example, at the moment, I have 2 PhD students, no 3, who have PhD studentships from various sources that allow them to work full-time. I have 8 who are part-time doing their PhD and part-time doing other things, teaching, have a regular job and so on. And that makes it really tough to stick with it for 4 years or even longer sometimes to the end point if you're studying part-time.
Folks, it's a 1/4 and we all of us need to get prepared for the next session, but I want to say thank you very, very much, Chris. It's a wonderful talk. It's going to help me with my geographic view for the Paramook. So very, very nice and just so wonderful to see Bob's legacy focused on in such a great way. So thank you very much. And remember, everybody, let me get to the end of that other slide. Remember, everybody, the next talk that's coming up is Fatima Machado, and she will be presenting her and Dr. Wellington Zangari's PowerPoint Parapsychology in Brazil, the history from the 1970s until today. So you can log on then. And thank you, everybody, for reminding me to copy the chat. I am doing that right now, as opposed to saying I'm doing it and not doing it. So Thank you very much. I'm going to close off the course and have a nice 15 minutes break, and we'll see you back at 1 p.m.
Bye-bye.